Good morning and good evening, everyone. So welcome to today's webinar, the use of health service research for clinical use. And today's webinar will be an interesting one as we will be learning more about how health service research is translated into clinical practice and decisions making. As you may have known that health service research has changed the way healthcare is delivered to patients and performance quality. The research has continually generated results that, if translated into policy and clinical practice, can improve health outcomes and provide better patient care. However, if the translations of this evidence rather practiced in a top-down manner rather than without considering the practice level, it will make it difficult for clinicians to utilize the new, decontextualized, and explicit knowledge in their daily work. And hence, communication among researchers, policymakers, and health leaders are needed to execute the planning of the research and oversee the management process, as well as evidence sharing from another healthcare settings is important to enrich our understanding. So therefore, HiTap is hosting this webinar to achieve such objective, as well as provide lessons learned for Thailand. And then before we begin, I would like to introduce some of the rules that I'd like you to follow. So please name your Zoom account as your name along with your organizations. And also, please kindly mute it while the speakers are presenting. And then we will have a questions and answer sessions. So if anyone would like to ask the speakers directly, please unmute yourself during the time. And you can also raise hand button on the Zoom and use the chat box. We will be recording this entire webinar and follow the PDP policy implementation in Thailand in order to share the recording. Moving forward to the agenda today, we will have Professor Nicholas Graves as the first speaker that will be sharing about his experience and reasons doing health service research and some of his experience in Singapore. And also he will provide some recommendations for low middle income countries and researchers in multi-country networks in improving their clinical research, followed by the next sessions by Dr. Somsak Chunharas that will speak on such reflections on Thailand perspective and experience on health service research in improving health service delivery. And the next, we will have questions and answer sessions, and we will close this webinar with some closing remarks. I would like you to know a background of Professor Nicholas Graves as well. He is the deputy director of the program in health service and system research at Duke-NUS and the SingHealth Duke-NUS Health Service Research Institute. His areas of knowledge include health economics, health service research, decisions making, and cost effectiveness. He's interested in projects that show high and low value care, as well as the process around implementing new policies. And then our next speaker, Dr. Somsak Chunharas, who's joining us from overseas tonight. And he formerly served as Deputy Minister of Health for Thailand and is currently the president of National Health Foundation in Thailand, an NGO promoting and coordinating evidence-based health policy and system development. Throughout his career in the Ministry of Health, Dr. Chunharas also directed several offices of the Ministry of Public Health, focusing on international health, health policy, and system development, and led various international collaboration. He also pioneered a team which led to various health reforms in Thailand, such as development of Thai Universal Healthcare System and Health Promotions Fund. All right, moving forward to the next agenda, we'll have a conversations with Professor Graves, and over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me today and organizing this webinar. I'm really delighted to be here in Thailand. And I'm very keen to learn more about the functioning of HiTap how health services research is conducted in Thailand, and broaden my network and get to know more people in this region. So just very briefly, you know, my background was from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where I did a PhD in the 1990s and learned a lot about the NHS. I then moved to Australia in 2002, where I built a health services research group at the Queensland University of Technology. And then in 2019, I moved to Singapore to take up a position at Duke-NUS. So as Ella has mentioned, my areas of interest are health economics, cost effectiveness, and value-based care. But what I really respond to and what I get very excited about is generating data to show how we can improve the performance of health services. So let's get started. I believe I have about 20 minutes. I'd like to cover 4 topics. The first of which is why we do health services research. Then I'll talk briefly about some other, so yeah, this is the first point. Then I'll talk, well, then I'll talk briefly about why, how health services research is prosecuted in other places, in particular the NHS. Then my third item will be some reflections on the work I've done in Singapore, particularly around building capacity for health services research by partnering with clinicians. And then I'll finish off with sort of 4 bullet point recommendations about what I think other settings might need to do for good health services research that has impact. All right, so why do we do health services research? Well, I have 4 sort of primary reasons. The first is that I think there's a simple but a very large challenge that's quite difficult to address. On one hand, you know, we have these administrators and government ministers and people in charge of healthcare budgets who are really stuck between a rock and a hard place. So the rock might be thought of as new demand and new supply, with an aging population, the rise of chronic diseases, and also a huge influx of new drugs, devices, and technologies. There's huge cost pressure on the health service. Now, the hard place would be the fact that many countries are now not increasing their health budgets, or they're only increasing them in line with inflation. So many countries have now drawn a line in the sand and said 8, 9, 10% of GDP is the maximum size we want our healthcare system to be. So there's this idea of non-increasing budget. So we now live very clearly in a world of scarce resources for healthcare. We can no longer solve the problems of healthcare just by spending more money year on year. So the only rational response to this difficult situation is, I believe, to improve the performance of health services, or to get more value from our current pot of scarce resources. And I think this challenge is actually larger than any of the other challenges that people often suggest a big problem, such as aging, obesity, diabetes, cancer. This idea of inefficiency or using our scarce resources wisely, I think, is a really, really large challenge. And you can think about a health service as spending money in 5 different ways. You can see cost increasing on the x-axis and health benefits measured by QALYs increasing on the y-axis. Now, health services do wonderful things around screening and primary prevention. This delivers large health benefits. Health services also provide very good routine care, dialysis, cardiac surgery, to name a few, that deliver, you know, good gains to health for an increment of cost. There may be some parts of health services that we deem low value, such as using the ICU for frail elderly. And then we move into 4 difficult areas of health services, one called waste, where maybe excess investigations and over-treatments represent a real waste of scarce resources. And then finally, the difficult area of adverse events, where we're actually using up scarce resources and causing harm to people. So as a health system, I think we need to reflect on waste and adverse events, reduce that as much as possible, and reallocate those scarce resources into high-value care, routine care, and in some cases, low-value care may be appropriate. And if we reflect from other countries, this is Elliot Fisher from the US, and he estimates quite conservatively that perhaps 1/3 of medical spending in the US is for services that do not improve healthcare. And I don't believe this just to be a US problem. I think this issue resonates in many health systems around the world. So the second reason I like doing health services research is that it's an opportunity to work with fantastic people. Now, this is a blog I wrote a few years ago about hybrid practitioners, and these are clinicians who roll their sleeves up and do health services research. And I'd make some comments about hybrid practitioners. I think they're a wonderful resource and a rare breed, because they combine an active clinical role with a research career. And by simultaneously participating in the worlds of research and practice, hybrid clinician researchers can really reconcile multiple tensions. And they enable knowledge flow between broader groups of researchers and practitioners. However, they face some challenges. They must maintain credibility in both worlds while avoiding prioritizing one to the detriment of the other. And hybrid roles in many places continue to be seen as unusual and unconventional. But these are very important people to work with, and they can have tremendous impact if we get that relationship right. The third reason I like to do health services research is it's not that hard to have impact. If we think about our colleagues doing basic research and clinical research, bench work, the potential benefit or impact is enormous. The sky is the limit. Whoever cures cancer or finds a way of managing sort of diabetes at low cost, the benefit or the impact is potentially enormous. But the probability of these breakthroughs are often very, very small. In contrast, health services research, we will never win a Nobel Prize. We will never do anything which is fundamental or groundbreaking. But the probability of us doing something which is useful and having impact is actually very large. So if we think about expected benefits, we could just put some numbers on these. These are made up, of course. But in basic and clinical research, if the benefit or impact is 100,000, but the probability is 0.01%, the expectation of our benefits is quite modest at 10. But in health services research, our benefit or impact is quite modest at 1,000, but the probability is relatively high. So our expected benefits are far larger. So the reason I have a picture of these beer pumps here is I think in basic and clinical research, maybe it's a long time between drinks, a long time between celebrations. So the fourth reason I like doing health services research, and this does apply to Singapore, where I'm currently based, is that there is now currently a large investment and a large effort of funding for health services research. We have our Research Innovation Enterprise Plan 2025, which has got many themes relevant to health and health services. And those of you that know the Singapore landscape will know these grant schemes, and they're very well funded, and there are many of them. So the funding taps and the funding streams for health services research have really been turned on. Okay, so I'll reflect briefly on what happens in other places, and particularly I'll focus on the NHS, where I spent the first part of my career. So the NHS based in the UK has a wonderful institution called NICE, the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence. And their job is to provide national guidance and advice to improve health and social care. And let's think about the job of these people. So NICE are really decision makers. They're the gatekeepers for funding, and they decide which services get funded and which services do not get supported with scarce resources. So they deal with scarcity of resources explicitly. And people at NICE, the decision makers at NICE, would either adopt a program based on good evidence, reject a program based on good evidence, or if the evidence is highly uncertain, they may postpone their decision. And so in the case of postponing, they then do the rational thing, which is to address the information that we don't have. So they would go to the National Institutes for Health and Care Research, which is a funding agency for health services research, and they would commission a piece of research or a study that allows them to make either an adopt or reject decision. So those of you familiar with the cost effectiveness framework, it may be that if NICE is considering new drug X, and we have 3 parameters for that decision, such as the effectiveness parameter, the costs parameter, and the quality of life outcomes, you'll see that quality of life is uncertain or low grade data or poorly specified. And this translates through to a cost effectiveness plane that looks something like this, where many of the simulations from our sensitivity analysis illustrate that adoption would be not cost effective. So there's only a 59% chance that adoption is going to be cost effective based on this information. So in this case, the people from NICE would say, we need to gather more data about quality of life outcomes for this new drug X, so we would fund the correct study. Once these data become available, you'll see that our quality of life outcomes have become a lot more precise. And in terms of our adoption decision, things are now much clearer. We've reduced that variance, we've reduced that uncertainty. So we now see an 82% chance that adoption is going to be the best decision. So I really like this approach to decision making and generating health services research outcomes. And indeed, if we look at the performance of the UK in terms of its quality of care, access, efficiency, the UK actually does very well. It scores very highly on this ranking table. This is from the Commonwealth Fund. So maybe NICE and National Institutes for Health Research are actually doing a great job organising the services provided by the NHS. Okay, I'll move on now to some of the work I'm doing in Singapore around capacity building for health services research. And predominantly, I'm trying to work with clinicians. So we have 4 main initiatives. We're funding research for clinicians, we're providing education programs, method support, and also we're doing specific activities within the health services. So I'll run through these briefly now. We have a program called the Hearts Grants, which is it's a funding program that's shared between SingHealth and Duke-NUS. Now, the types of work we like to support, we want to support simple projects. So that our first criteria is that the research we fund will demonstrate how improvements to the performance of health services can be achieved. So we're not looking for high-risk projects. We're not looking for very early stage projects. We're looking for the low-hanging fruit. So we want ideas which are relatively simple and have a clear pathway to impact. We also want the number of patients who may benefit from the research to be reasonably large. And crucially, we require that a faculty from Duke-NUS is part of the research team. So the clinicians from the health service apply for this, but they must have a meaningful partnership with a Duke-NUS faculty member. And here are 2 projects we've recently funded. The first with Whiting, who's a cardiologist, and one with Kinjal, who's a psychologist. So the work we're doing with Whiting Huang is to look at the costs and health outcomes from managing high-risk patients with coronary artery disease with different interventions. We're basically modeling the cost effectiveness of being less invasive, so doing less PCI stents, retaining more patients on medical management, and we're demonstrating large cost savings for no loss of health outcomes. So this is a really nice way of demonstrating a lower cost option for cardiology. The second project I'll feature briefly is from Kinjal, and she's doing a discrete choice experiment for stroke survivors and their family to understand what they value about post-stroke management programs, so we can tailor and provide the programs that are the most meaningful to survivors and their family. So like I say, we funded 16 of these projects so far, $65,000 per project, and we're finding them to be a very nice way of engaging or motivating clinicians to generate good outcomes. We also have an education arm. So I'll talk now about our graduate certificate program in health services innovation. We have 4 units which have been designed to fit together. They're consistent, they're complementary. We use the same terminology throughout. We share many instructors across the modules, and these modules are actually stackable to a master's at NUS. The fees are covered by Skills Future Accreditation, which is a government-led funding scheme, and we've recruited 30 to 50 healthcare professionals per year. And we're very keen for these professionals to work together. You know, they're a prospective cohort of healthcare professionals. They get to know each other, they support each other, they have challenges which they get over together. There's lots of team working in the cohort. So by the end of the 2-year program, they've really made some new friendships and some new networks which will help them move forward. We are now engaging our 3rd cohort. We began in March 2021. We're also engaging a range of our faculty here in the teaching. We have 4 modules. The first is implementation science, then research methods for health services research, which is basically an introduction to statistics and study design. We then have a program on HTA, cost effectiveness and decision making, and our final module is around healthcare and data science. We are developing these modules into an online academy, which will be short courses, which will be non-credit bearing, so you won't contribute. People won't get credit bearing points for a master's, but they can get a cut down version of the material by learning online. This is aimed at adult learners. We want a higher volume of students, and they will be a much lower cost offering. So our 3rd activity is to provide method support for clinicians. So what we offer is small group consultations with clinicians, and we offer these methods supports around cost effectiveness, implementation science, qualitative methods, grant writing, and you can see the rest of them there. And those numbers are just the numbers of people that have been through our methods clinic. So we have a content expert available for an hour or 2, and we have typically 3 or 4 clinicians who come along, pitch their problem, ask their question, and they have a very sort of productive time getting advice from people who really know the area quite well. So this has been a wonderful way of engaging and shaping research ideas and also making new partnerships. The final thing I'll talk about is some of the work we're doing directly with health services. So I've partnered with Wei Wei Hong here. She works for SingHealth. So we have a nice collaboration, health services meets research. And we've set up something called the Impact Assessment Unit, which is an in-house research team. Now, there are many, many new ideas and new projects coming up through the grassroots of health services in SingHealth, and many of them get adopted and scaled without any serious evaluation. The person leading them might be influential, might be powerful, might have some funding, and so is able to push things through for that reason. Now, the role of our Impact Assessment Unit is to actually look at these projects and triage the valuable ones. So we're now putting sort of a block in front of some projects which we don't think are going to be valuable to SingHealth for a number of reasons. And our value criterion, we have published those in a paper, or the paper is currently under review, but we have a very nice triaging algorithm that weeds out the programs which we don't think are going to be useful or valuable to health services. So we reduce the number quite dramatically. We've had 88 projects proposed, and only 17 have survived function 1. So the 17 that do survive progress into function 2, which is really an evidence evaluation program. And here the Impact Assessment Unit becomes a research partner with the clinicians. So we offer biostats, implementation, cost effectiveness, whatever it may be, in order to allow the clinicians to build their health services research, design very nice projects, and generate early stage data about the value and the cost effectiveness of their innovation. If we do get to the stage with these function 2 projects where we're doing evaluations, where we can recommend adoption, and that's a good outcome, or we could even recommend rejection, but it's likely that we may not have quite the evidence we need because we're going to be doing lots of modeling studies. So if we do get to a position where we're still uncertain about the value of these innovations, we may say, let's postpone, and then let's partner to write a grant and try and gather the information we need in order to make the adoption decision or the value proposition very clear. So there's 2 case studies I'll mention. One thing, we're working, as I said, with 18 groups on the function 2. The first one is a seizure detection app with the National Neuroscience Institute. And this is a wearable that allows the early warning of seizure to be flagged. And so it allows people with a high risk of having a seizure to get to a safe place. Our main outcomes are that we will reduce the risk of injury, transportation to hospital, and other use of health services. So this is something that we're evaluating with Dr. Yi Ling. The second case study is working with the I group. So only 30% of urgent referrals from our polyclinics in the community to our specialist center, SNEC, were correctly urgent. So there's a lot of stuff being referred which doesn't need to be referred urgently. Now SNEC have developed an AI app to potentially improve this, and it'll be a sort of a much faster way of processing patients, processing cases, and making decisions about a correct urgent referral. And we're assessing the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of this innovation. So the purpose of the Impact Assessment Unit is not to test hypotheses, which I believe use arbitrary rules and conventions. Rather, our outcome is the probability that adoption is going to be a good decision, given uncertainty. So as I said before, at the end of our function 2 work, our evaluation work, we will either adopt or reject with some level of confidence, or postpone, and we would recommend gathering more data, such as from a prospective trial with new funding. So I like this approach because we can identify the information that is valuable for decision making, and our research funding now becomes based on an economic rationale and not arbitrary peer review. Okay, so my final few points, my advice for low middle income countries, but really I think this advice is relevant to any health service, is the first point I made, one of the early points I made, is that I believe the biggest challenge might actually be inefficiency. If we're investing somewhere between 30 and 50% of our scarce resources on programs that don't deliver benefits or even harm patients, then really addressing waste and adverse events and redirecting those scarce resources into high value care and other valuable services, I think that's really where health services should be shining a light. The other piece of advice I would give is that I think all health services need to find and motivate their change agents. And these tend to be clinicians, doctors, nurses, allied health, other healthcare professionals. And these hybrid practitioners or these change agents understand the problem, they understand the solution. They often are interested and curious about developing their research skills. So they can be a wonderfully powerful resource to engage. And just to follow on from that, I believe the partnership between academics and clinicians can be very productive. So where the clinicians have insights into the grassroots of health services, they understand the nuts and bolts of health services, they don't always have the research methods at their fingertips. So bringing in academics to bring in the specialist skills, I think, again, adds tremendous value to this work. And finally, I think research should be valuable for decision making. So just to reiterate the point I made about do the piece of research that allows you to make the best decision in an evidence-based way or with an economic rationale behind it. I think that's an immensely important way to think about funding research. And as I said, the NHS, I think, does this beautifully. And I think other countries could learn a lot from their model. So that's all I had. I'm very happy to, well, I think I'll hand over and maybe we'll have some Q&A at the end. Although I do see a couple of questions here. Ella, would you like me to handle these questions now, or shall we store them up for later?
Thank you, Professor Grubbs, for very informative introductions and presentations. We have a few questions here. Would you like to address now, or we will be talking more in the questions and answer sessions?
Yeah, I think I've kept to time. So rather than take more time than I should, why don't we answer these questions in the Q&A?
Okay, sure. Perfect. Thank you. And moving on to the next speaker, Dr. Somsak Chunharas will be presenting such reflections on Thailand situation. Dr. Somsak, are you ready?
Yep. Okay, I will share my slide. Thank you, Professor Nick, for the excellent presentation. I certainly hope that I will be able to share some experiences. But first of all, let me say that, this is my personal reflection based on our experiences, because in Thailand, we have the Health System Research Institute, established in 1992. I was the founding director then. So I had the chance to sort of, think and learn and do many things. But I would like to highlight the fact that we call us what we are doing, health system research. And it has a lot to do with how the Thai look at health system rather than just healthcare system or health services system. So when we are so-called promoting or advocating or supporting health system research, we sort of look at the three different groups: the health system, which is the broadest one, and then the health services research, and then healthcare research, which basically, working with clinicians or providers has more to do with the last two groups. But our experiences has also been a lot with the health system research one. Of course, as I have put in this slide, there are many other ways that we could classify how many groups of or subgroups of health system research we are going to talk about. But as I say, we tend to use the word systems to reflect more on the macro kind of research. In other words, the research that would influence or contribute to the macro policy and system design and development, rather than just research aiming at improving practices. So as I say, we had a slightly different focus. The clinical part or the practice part that Professor Nick talked about is something that we have been trying to promote or trying to develop further beyond the so-called macro system research. But the other thing that I'd like to point out is that, at least in Thailand, I think we share the same concept and expectation, which is the utilization. So we believe that the good research has to be more relevant rather than just on methodology. In fact, there's no particular methods in health system research or health services research, but we need to keep the balance. In other words, ensuring that the research results are relevant to utilization, and make sure that when the research is completed, we can make sure that it is used as well. So it has to be based on excellent or trustworthy methodologies. There are many examples here. I would like to just spend some time on this. As I say, the research affecting UHC policy and system design has been one of the examples that we kept referring to when we talk about health system research in Thailand. It goes even to the point of doing research on implementation, access to services, the impact on catastrophic illnesses, for example. Primary healthcare system is another thing that we have been doing a lot of research, even long before the establishment of the Health System Research Institute. The Ministry of Public Health took leadership in doing the research with external fundings, of course. And then when we have the district health system and primary healthcare, we continue to do research as to how we could develop the district health system to improve patient utilization, patient referral, and things like that. And we have also a care model for specific problems such as long-term care or even dementia, and service plan for NCD control, which emphasize more on prevention. Thalassemia prevention and control is another example that we do research that emphasize more on primary health care. And of course, what we call the community actions for health. Of course, the last 3 points has more to do with the clinical research part, which as I noticed is Professor Graves' focus. But we again, have some slightly different experiences. For example, in terms of clinical research, we benefited a lot from the approach called the clinical registration. And we have only a few good examples. Cardiovascular has been one of the examples that we use the registry. And the research has led to several findings in terms of risk factors, hyperlipidemia, or even the development of the so-called cardiovascular risk score assessment. On the other hand, we also have some clinical trial, not only the new drugs, but on repurposing drugs such as ivermectin for dengue hemorrhagic fever. And we are trying to do some so-called RCT for drugs in COVID-19. And of course, we did some COVID vaccine combination study as well to find what would be the so-called proper combination that would yield high enough antibody level when we have problem with the vaccine shortage. And the last example that I like to highlight is the fact that we have some small scale context-specific provider-initiated healthcare research, which we call R2R or routine to research. We have shared these experiences with some hospitals in Singapore. I believe that the Tan Tok Seng team has been visiting Thailand and learned about the R2R. People have different interpretation about that, but I would certainly call that a small scale clinical research in the sense that they do research to improve patient care, although they don't specifically focus on technology utilization, but reducing waste would be one of the possible outcomes as well. Again, I like to point out that we try to focus on the research questions rather than research methodology to ensure utilization. And in terms of capacity development, I like to reflect on the fact that in Thailand, we have been trying a lot not only to improve research capability, but also on the utilization as well. So it's not only capacity of the supply side, but also the demand side. And of course, we also emphasize on not only doing training or degree courses, we have a lot of hands-on experiences or hands-on work. HITAP is a very good example because HTA research has benefited a lot from the investment in the institutionalization of HITAP and its network development. So the network worked through projects, real-world projects that would influence benefit package development of the Thai UHC program, as well as the National Essential Drug List, the two very important contribution. HITAP tried to do many other research to influence clinical practices to reduce waste. But I think that we still have a long way to go in terms of organizing networks of clinicians and clinical institutions to make sure that we can do that. But frankly, the degree or non-degree program has not been very, very useful in terms of producing researchers. In other words, they got the training, but not many of them would come into the field to do research. And of course, the last point is that we try to make sure that we have processes to influence key stakeholders to better understand how to use and how to be engaged in defining research questions through their priority policy questions or practice problems. And we try to establish different evidence-based policy processes and platforms as well. We see this as another capacity building for the key stakeholders from the utilization point of view. I won't go into detail about this because I think Professor Grave has mentioned about the importance of engaging provider as researchers rather than just what people like to call professional researchers. But I made this slide because in one of my meetings, with WHO, when they were trying to define country profile of researchers, one of the definition is professional researchers, those who got PhD and so on and so forth. And we debated a lot on whether healthcare providers who are doing research should not be counted as researchers as well. And I agree with Professor Graves that it is a very important part if you really want to have a health system research, especially health services research that would yield results, whether they are doing it on a small scale or on a larger scale, or even on an area based such as the SingHealth context. It's definitely something that is very context specific. In Thailand, we also try to do different levels, as they say, R2R focus on institutional level or provider level. But we are trying also to develop something that would have impact on the area level. And for that, the Ministry of Public Health has the service plan, which has been trying to ensure that there would be research also at the regional level through the providers network. I'll go to the last point, which I believe that, when we talk about the future of health services research, I believe that the age of big data, making use of electronic medical record and personal health record would be something that we need to be talking more about. In other words, it might have to go into the so-called big data analytics rather than the usual clinical research design and data collection. But I won't go into more details about that. So the key reflection, or you could call challenges for the future development of health system research in Thailand, has about these 6 points that I like to summarize. The first one is how do we ensure relevance over excellence, or imbalance of excellence, and how do we make sure that utilization is also part of the research process, not only in research knowledge production, capacity building, as I say, of both supply and demand side, and capacity in knowledge utilization is also as important as capacity in knowledge production. Knowledge translation and dissemination is another important competencies and capability that we wanted to see developing in Thailand. And capacity building through degree programs may not, or short course training may not be enough, or may not be cost effective if not effective enough. And of course, the last part is the point that research to influence evolutionary nature of policy and system development is very important. So we certainly hope to have mechanisms and teams who could do more long-term study rather than a single-time project. And again, the use of big data from the real world on a continuous basis would certainly help to shape the clinical practices and services delivery in the future. I'll stop there. I hope there's something that could add to what Professor Grave has already excellently mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Somsak. That's very informative, and we definitely learned a lot from your presentations. And now we open the floor for both speakers to reflect and comment on each other's presentations. So we invite Professor Graves, if you have any reflections from Dr. Somsak's presentations. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Nothing, I agree with everything Dr. Somsak presented, and I think we were kind of agreeing on many issues. I think we were picking up the same points around engaging clinicians, building capacity, and doing research that has impact and research that matters. I think Dr. Somsak and myself are sort of very united on this, that the best way to improve a health system is to improve it from the inside out. And that has to be led by clinicians who are motivated, passionate, well-funded and supported. And that does actually speak to some of the comments we've had. Maybe I'll just jump into one of the questions here about challenges in applying health services. Oh no, hang on. I'm sure there was a question here about what kind of incentives would help increase uptake of such innovations by clinicians in a more systematic manner. So, you know, I think what we need to do is to empower our clinicians to do health services research. They're often very curious, that maybe they don't have the skills and the background to lead bench or basic science research, but they do want to do some form of research. And health services research is a fairly you know, possible way of getting a research career started. The problem is that clinicians don't have any time. They work incredibly long hours. All their time is dedicated to patients. And so one thing that Singapore is trying to do is to develop clinician scientists where there's fellowships and funding and grants available to buy out the time of clinicians. And I think this is a very valuable investment. So that would be, you know, my reflections on where we're overlapping. And also, I think I've answered maybe one of the questions we have here. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'd like to
Professor.
add to the point about motivation of clinicians using results of health system research. You know, I think that's also the challenge in Thailand. We have a number of examples. One of the things that I think I can share is the cesarean section, the excessive cesarean section rate, which, you know, even the Royal College of Obstetricians try to promote proper practices, minimizing or reducing the number of unnecessary or even harmful cesarean section. They didn't succeed very well. They tried to do all kinds of communication, even through social media and things like that. Again, you know, practice guideline could be seen as one of the examples, but again, practice guidelines definitely optional. Another approach that we try to do in terms of influencing clinical practices is through the National Institute of Hospital Accreditation. But the Hospital Accreditation Institute also try to stay away from specific interventions, specific outcomes assessment, unless they are very, very much of high priority. So I think that's still a very big challenge. Whether engaging them to do research itself or by themselves would help. Definitely could be one of the strategies. I think one of the examples is when we try to do the Vasisumab drug for the macular degeneration, rather than using the so-called newly produced or introduced drug, which is much more expensive. When ophthalmologists engage or took part in the studies through the Royal College, they also have some influences to convince the clinicians of the value of the studies. But again, as I say, it depends on the topics and depend on how contentious or how deep-rooted their tacit knowledge and experiences are with regards to those practices. Over to you.
I might comment on the C-section example, because I'm guessing that there's a very powerful stakeholder group involved. You know, the obstetricians, I'm sure, have strong incentives maybe to do C-sections, and they would be a powerful group. And so, you know, one way I think we've seen other specialties tackle this is to endorse the choosing wisely approach. I don't know if choosing wisely is gaining traction in Thailand, but certainly in the US, the UK and Australia, we have active choosing wisely programs where the clinicians themselves reflect on their practice, they consult the evidence, and they write their own guidelines. So I think that building that knowledge and that culture from within the specialty is a particularly useful approach. And also this can be thought of more broadly in an implementation science framework. So why don't we apply the methods of implementation science and the theory to deconstruct the problem? So who are the stakeholders? What are the barriers? What are the enablers? What are the perverse incentives? And how do we overcome them? You know, I love implementation science because it's not that complicated, but it's enormously powerful. It takes a lot of hard work and a lot of determination to keep the project moving, but understanding you know, where the power lies and where the incentives lie and where the pinch points are in a systematic way is a very, very useful approach. So those would be my comments. And that example, I think, can be extended to many areas of low value care, but the C-section one, I think, is a particularly nice one to think through. Thank you.
And moving forward to one of the questions in the chat box for Professor Graves. Given your extensive experience, can you give an example of the challenge of implementing health service research from one setting to another? And if you also could give the example from Singapore settings, it would be also great, because one some of the challenge that we have in Thailand here, that we don't have nobody that making such decisions, and also challenge around EC approval. So over to you, Professor Grips.
All right, thanks, Ella. I think that's all the questions in one, so I might just take it one by one. But the challenge of describing a project that's had impact in Singapore, well, there have been many. You know, one I will mention is using artificial intelligence for identifying diabetic retinopathy. So, you know, we have some very nice research that demonstrates a deep learning system is able to correctly, or has a sensitivity of 91% for diabetic retinopathy and specificity for 92%. And for glaucoma, they're both above 96%. So this replaces the role of humans. It does it at a fraction of the cost, and it saves a lot of repetitive, you know, time-consuming, expensive tasks being done. That research has been done at the data science level. The deep learning system published many papers. Also, the cost-effectiveness work has been published, and also the implementation work has been published. So what does it take to get this program into place? And now it's routinely used in health services. So I think that's a real success story. Something else I've been involved with is the identification of serious pressure injuries among acute patients. Now, these are problems which should, you know, in many cases never happen. We looked at all the pressure injuries coming through Singapore General Hospital, the serious ones, the stage 3s and the stage 4s, which are very unpleasant and costly and difficult to deal with. And we found that none of them were healthcare required, which is a fantastic endorsement on the quality of nursing. So the nursing interventions were able to stop pressure ulcers at stage 2, but they all came in from the community. In particular, they came in from the home setting. So about 10% came from nursing homes, but about 90% came from private individuals who were languishing at home, maybe not neglected, but maybe not recognizing the risk factors, families not recognizing the risk factors. And these patients had very long stays, up to 20 days in hospital, often poor outcomes, generating exceptionally high cost. So in response, we now are developing a program of interventions to screen, look for risk factors, again, using smartphones and AI technology to look for skin that may be on the way to getting a pressure injury. So that's earlier stage, but it's something that we can do to prevent this problem early before it ends up in the acute setting. So Dr. Somsak, please jump in to answer any of these questions if you like, or I can keep working through them. We have them in the Q&A box here.
Let me share some experiences on this question about transferring results of research across contexts. Because at least, you know, again, we talk a lot about the fact that health system or health services research, even on a macro scale, is something that is very much context specific. And its context specific lies in its nature of the health service delivery systems, not in the practice. The practices could be research, could be studied to be cost effective or to be effective, and new ways of working could be introduced. But applying that into a different system context require a lot of changes. And that's why, you know, in my first few slides, I think it's good to differentiate between clinical research and health services research in that sense. And health services research may have a lot to do with how we understand the different factors surrounding the health system in which a particular practice need to be implemented or need to be applied. And you know, there are two practical steps. First of all is, of course, someone may like to do a small scale study of the same interventions or of the same so-called suggested practices. But then the other part, which is even more important, is the scaling up. Even in a context, in a same country context, if you do a so-called pilot size study or, you know, small scale or multi-site studies, you have difficulties in scaling that up into the whole system context, because the whole system has a different so-called surrounding in different regions, different areas as well. So I think that's the beauty of health services research, as Professor Graff has mentioned. Unless you do studies like that, people may not be that convinced, or they may not see the ways to go ahead implementing some of the examples. So I think implementing across context is something very, very important to consider when we are doing health services research, and define the research questions beyond what practices, but what factors, what system context that we should be changing. Of course, one of the contexts is practitioner attitudes and behavior and background, as we discussed in the case of the cesarean section. Over to you.
Professor Graves, you're still.
Oh, I'm so
unmuted.
sorry. There was a siren, so I muted. Yeah, I'll take the next one about high impact factor journals. You know, I think the landscape is changing very nicely for us, in that a lot of the big publishing houses and the big journal names such as BMJ, Nature, Lancet, and JAMA are now offering really high quality open access journals. And sure, they may not have the impact factor of 30 or 50, but they have impact factors of above 5. And JAMA Network has an impact factor of 13. And this is an open access journal that will take a high volume of papers. And their main criteria is not that it's tremendously novel, but that it's been done to a high standard, and that the methods are strong, the conclusions are strong, the data are reasonable, and it's answering an interesting research question. So I think the opportunity to publish in open access journals, which are attached to a big name journal, so they look good on our CV, politicians are impressed when they see Nature and Lancet. I think that avenue is improving for us. The only downside is we have to pay money, and these are not cheap journals, sometimes up to $3,000 to get one paper published. So, you know, that is a problem. So good and bad there, but I think there are places to publish. Okay, the next one is for you, Dr. Somsak, directly, I think. The next question.
What's the next question? Can you?
The next question for Dr. Somsak is have you seen any incentive for those to work hard reducing wasteful health service investment? If yes, what are they? And if not, how can we make them available?
You mean the
incentive
people who are using the research? Sorry that I could not read the chat very clearly. Sorry, because my computer is too small.
Yes. So have you seen any incentive for those that working to reduce the wasteful health service investment? If yes, what are they? And if not, how can we make them available?
You mean the incentive, meaning the motivation of those who make decisions on how? I mean, let me share this on this part about those who are talking about waste. The question asks about the investment, but as Professor Graff mentioned, one of the important player in reducing waste are the practitioners. So if you're talking about investor, for example, we used to talk about the fact that we should not invest too much on making MRI available or CT scan in those days. And in the present day, we were talking about the proton accelerator for cancer therapy, for example. I think those are the high ticket investment, high ticket instrument investment. And the people who made those decisions are the top policy makers who may not have the knowledge about the practices. But on the other hand, what Professor Graff mentioned is the motivation of the practitioner themselves to try to reduce waste. And I believe that you need different interventions on that. For the first part, which is the macro investment on high cost in equipment, I think we have to do a lot of the so-called social communication rather than just convincing the policy makers themselves, because they might have their vested interest in procuring or ensuring that they invest in those instruments. But on the other hand, you know, at the institutional level, HTA could also be very, very useful to convince them not to invest in the so-called wasteful, or to choose the right, the most cost-effective machines or technologies. But again, you know, back to the practitioner part, that's the most challenging part if we believe that the so-called improving practices to reduce waste would be one. And of course, I would certainly still put emphasis on institutional arrangement, as we have seen in the case of introducing lean and wasteful analysis. One of the things that we try to do in the quality improvement practices is what we call utilization review. In other words, if a hospital do utilization review, they'll get recognized for being in a so-called good quality practice circle. So they could be better, they could be more likely to be accredited. Without proper utilization review, for example, they might not be recognized as in the so-called good quality practice circles. So the institutional arrangement, environmental influences are very important to change the motivation or to change the practices of practitioners. It's not only education, it's not only telling them what the research results are. You need to make sure that there are institutional arrangement, if not the penalty at the so-called macro system level. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Somsak, for the explanations. And maybe the last questions before the closing remarks. One question to you, Professor Graves. What has been the experience and impact of conducting the method support for the clinicians?
Yeah, they're somewhat difficult to evaluate other than just their anecdotal feedback that they've enjoyed the sessions and they've learned something. These people were writing grants and doing research anyway, so it's hard to say that we made a huge difference, but I'd like to think that their grants were better, their ideas were better, and we were one part of the jigsaw that helped them succeed. And I think when you are learning something new, it's often nice to have a safety blanket behind you, an expert to pick up the phone to have a chat, just clear up a few items. So, my gut feeling is that it's a valuable thing to do, and it's very low cost. We ask our faculty to spend maybe 4 or 5 hours with groups every few months. So it's not as if it takes a lot of time. So I don't have any hard evidence, I'm afraid, but I still think it's a smart thing to do.
Let me add something on this part, because I mentioned a lot about beyond training, and that has been based very much on our effort to do research training in Thailand. And more recently, when we set up this R2R network, where as I say, providers like to do research or are promoted or supported to do research. When we ask them what actually are their priority needs or support, they'll say they want networking and learning with each other rather than just methodology training. And of course, we still do methodology training because we believe that for practitioners to be doing good research based on their own question, they need to also be taking the methodology seriously. But the methodology will come after they have been they have identified their own research. And one of the things that we try to do is to develop supportive mechanisms, again within institutions or within the region, to make sure that they were supported throughout their process of defining their question, sharpening their questions, planning for methodologies, and doing the research. Again, the granting part is not also very much of a problem when you are doing small scale research. But when you are doing a larger part, as Professor Graves mentioned, having training as part of the granting process is definitely very helpful. But if you have people who have been motivated to ask questions and wanted to do some research, maybe you need to do a combination of both the training as well as the continuous support for them to really do it. Because one of the things the Professor Graves has mentioned, which is also the experience in Thailand, is that they are very much burdened with their day-to-day services. And at one point, they will be asking themselves why they are doing the research, because it's definitely the priority is on the service provision. So the supportive system, encouragement, as well as many other facilitating factors would also be very important to set up to enable them to do good research. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Graves and Dr. Somsak, for all the answers. And before we closing the webinar, any final words from both speakers? Please, over to you.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I know we don't have much time, but we couldn't answer all the questions. I'm reading them now and they're wonderful questions. I'd love to sink my teeth into some of these questions here. So thank you for such a engaging session and giving me the time to to speak with you. So, you know, I'm enjoying being in Singapore. There are many challenges there, but Singapore's a really tiny country. And so, you know, I'm excited to work with other countries in this region. You know, I'm very keen to get to know Thai researchers, do more research in Thailand and also other countries in this region. So, you know, part of my reason for, you know, having this session, and thank you for organizing it, is to build my network, hopefully learn about other people, other projects, and broaden my base of contacts. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and very nice to hear your presentation, Dr. Somsak. Thank you so much for your contribution as well.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Grave, for your also very interesting experiences, as I mentioned. But I think the more important thing is for the next step. And I believe, as I say, that HiTap has been trying also to promote better research to reduce waste, or even to try to introduce Thailand to the choosing wisely approaches. So, you know, we could learn more from Professor Grave's experiences, both in the US, in Singapore, and in many other countries, as he have already mentioned. So I hope that HiTap would get us connected. Of course, the Thai researcher would certainly benefit a lot from that. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And as we're reaching to the closing times, we'd like to say we'd like to apologize for the unanswered questions, but we will address them in our draft meeting, and we'll also share this webinar on our YouTube channels. So thank you again, Dr. Somsak and Professor Graves, for the valuable input. As we pretty sure we have taken many reflections points, and we'll also be reflecting on them as we are moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, bye-bye.